Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman here in our Northwest Side studio.
And I'm Schutz reporting live from Bronzeville on the city's south side.
On the show tonight, Chicago's next steps in police reform, plus community organizations that can reduce calls to the police. Could the coronavirus affect the cost of health care? How the class of 2020 is going out. And a nonprofit delivering art supplies to children throughout the city.
And Brandis, as I mentioned, I'm co-anchoring tonight in Bronzeville, historic neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. We'll have the very latest on how COVID-19 and the events of the last 2 weeks have impacted this community. But first, we toss it back to you.
Finally got some good weather. Thank you, Paris. Chicago's bars and tap rooms have been given the green light to reopen. On Wednesday, bars, lounges, taverns, and breweries can reopen for outdoor service. Customers must be seated at outside tables that are 6 feet apart with 6 or fewer people per table. Patrons can only be seated for a maximum of 2 hours, and on-site alcohol sales at bars and restaurants will end at 11 o'clock. Starting next Monday, Chicago's iconic Lakefront Trail will have a limited reopening. Only about half of the access points to the lakefront will be open to walkers, runners, and cyclists, but new rules require users to stay in constant motion. Keep it moving, people. The news comes as the state reported its lowest daily death toll from COVID-19 in more than 2 months. Illinois health officials say another 19 people have died from the coronavirus. The state now has a total of 6,326 known coronavirus deaths. There are more than 450 newly reported cases, bringing the total number of statewide cases to more than 133,000. Meanwhile, Governor J.B. Pritzker announces $275 million in emergency relief funds available for low-income residents who've been impacted by COVID-19. These funds are immediately available to help with food, rent, utilities, and more for eligible residents. Applications are at helpillinoisfamilies.com. And the governor is also voicing his support for licensing police officers in the wake of George Floyd's death and protests demanding police reform.
You also don't want people who've committed these kinds of acts in one police department to leave that police department and then have a clean record when they go to another police department and, you know, they're not held accountable for what happened in the first one. So that's an example of why licensing is being proposed, and we're looking very hard at that as part of the agenda.
Chicago's police union opposes licensing, saying it would be used as a way around the union contract to fire officers like the ones found napping in Congressman Bobby Rush's office during the protests. The Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police will meet with Attorney General Kwame Raoul, who supports the idea, to discuss it. There's more on licensing the police and the use of force policy coming up on the program. Meanwhile, a group of aldermen want to end Chicago police officers working inside public schools. Mayor Lightfoot opposes the idea of pulling officers out of schools, saying they keep schools safe. The ordinance would end the $33 million contract that assigns police to schools within 75 days. The city council meets Wednesday, but we'll have more on this ordinance with aldermen on tomorrow night's show. The Supreme Court handed down a big win for LGBTQ rights. In a 6-3 ruling, the conservative-leaning court ruled that people cannot lose their jobs based on sexual orientation or because they are transgender.
Federal protections are crucial for us. They help us in various ways that state protections do not. And it's certainly important to have the full range of protections. The bottom line is this is sex discrimination. It's a simple decision in the sense that the court recognized what we've known for many years.
The Supreme Court also declined to hear the Illinois State Rifle Association's appeal to a long-standing Cook County ordinance banning the possession, use, or sale of assault weapons and large-capacity magazines. The group had argued the law violated the Second Amendment. All across Chicago, communities are rebuilding from the twin crises of the COVID-19 pandemic and the widespread property damage that took the attention away from peaceful protests 2 weeks ago. These have both impacted businesses, but also residents who are dealing with rent and mortgage payments. It's all been felt in Bronzeville, the historic heart of Black Chicago culture. Paris Schutz has been reporting on the ground in Bronzeville all day, and he joins us now live at 35th and King Drive. Paris.
Yeah, Brandis, and we're in front of another monument, the Victory Monument in honor of African Americans that served in World War I. It's one of many monuments and landmarks in this very historic neighborhood that has been a hub of black cultural life in America, home to jazz and blues artists like Muddy Waters and the original Checkerboard Lounge. And like other neighborhoods, it's slowly crawled back from decades of disinvestment to revitalize a little bit with the help of community anchors who have been here for many years. But a local development group says that the looting and the property damage of the last 2 weeks, plus COVID-19, has put some of that in jeopardy.
Some of these businesses had been around for a very long time. These businesses are now struggling to rebuild. As a result of that activity, we're bearing higher security costs. So we actually, even though we were not directly affected with any of our work by the uprising, we contributed to a security fund for 51st Street. And so it affects all of us.
And the Sean Michelle Ice Cream Shop is one of the newer businesses that has weathered both the shutdown and the uprising of 2 weeks ago. It's located in the newly rehabbed historic Julius Rosenwald apartment buildings. The store's manager says though they might have been concerned for what was happening in the neighborhood, they felt positive that their business would be left alone because it is so important to Bronzeville.
We get up every day and we come into the shop, and it's like we don't let anything else deter us from that. So with that goal in mind, we've been able to continue to service the community and put smiles on people's faces. And during this time, I think that's very important.
And you can't mention Bronzeville without mentioning the beautiful gray and brown stones, many located here along King Drive. Third Ward Alderman Pat Dowell tells me the community has cleaned up well from the events of a couple weeks ago, but another storm could be coming, that of evictions and foreclosures, which is why the city's Council's Housing Committee met today to approve further aid for renters and a structure for renters and landlords to work out back pay.
I believe Bronzeville will be hit hard. That's why it was really important to support rental assistance funding. I mean, we need much more of that. If we pass this rental assistance bill in City Council this week, it's only $20 million. We need much more support from the state and the federal government. It's not just renters, but also owners who are renting to renters who have to pay a mortgage. Those people will also be impacted.
And another landmark here is the Harold Washington Cultural Center, which has sat vacant for much of the shutdown, although continued to provide some programs for CPS kids. Director Gemelita Tillman says that waiting until Phase 5 to fully reopen is too long, and that she wants state and federal agencies to help assist theaters like hers upgrade for sanitation and safety. And as the nation's largest black-owned independent theater, Tillman says it should be a center right now for all the discussions that are happening around race.
We're ready to go. We're ready to open up our stages and hit the first note on that stage, be it a blues show, be it a poetry set, be it a stage play. We're ready to go because we have content ready to rock. We can drop the screen and show films here at the Harold Washington Cultural Center. Racism has been here, and in order to undo where it is, it's going to take the creatives to be able to create the content. It's going to take the venues to be able to say, we hear you and we're ready to put to action, and working closely with our elected officials to do so.
And nearby at a shuttered CPS school, a group of community organizers came together on June 2nd to help Bronzeville respond to the property damage. So they formed the Southside Food Distribution Network to aid Bronzeville, and they've since expanded that to serve much of the South Side.
We chose food access, but also in our food access program, we're providing toiletries, baby items, feminine products, a slew of other things that we know, essential items that we know that our community will need. And today, to this date, we've now served a few thousand, over 3,000 individuals across Southside communities.
And on a positive note, the COVID-19 rate in Bronzeville has been lower than other Chicago neighborhoods, especially other Chicago black and brown neighborhoods, although the neighborhood has felt the economic impact. And we'll have more on how Bronzeville is trying to rebuild in just a bit. But first, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
We'll take the good news where we can get it, Paris. Thank you. The latest among Chicago police practices under scrutiny, use of force. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot announces a community group will review the Chicago Police Department's policies. But even before the committee's first meeting, there's already controversy. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda.
Brandis, among the many takeaways that we have from the widespread protests that sparked in the wake of George Floyd's death, the protests that we continue to see, is this: that community residents, those who actually live in Chicago, want a say in how their city is policed. And to that end, this isn't your typical committee. This is a community working group with members that, yes, do include aldermen and experts, but also what the mayor's describing as a diverse group of volunteers. This group is going to be co-chaired by a CPD deputy chief and also by Arewa Karen Winters, whose nephew was shot and killed by police in 2016. Winters says she's incensed that certain officers remain on the force despite having been involved in such shootings.
Other cities are firing them, and here they get 30 days desk duty, and then they return back to the streets in our communities, as far as I'm concerned, psychopaths with guns. So I am infuriated. I am furious.
Winters says she will serve in her new role with unfleeting integrity.
In this trilogy between myself and the mayor and the superintendent, I have more power because I can go straight up to the federal judge to get enforcement.
That's a reference to the federal judge charged with overseeing how the CPD is conforming with a consent decree that is simultaneously forcing the CPD to adapt. The new leader of the Chicago Fraternal Order of Police says he wishes that Mayor Lightfoot would have cut Winters off during the press conference. He says any discussion about reform needs to begin with open dialogue.
She clearly has an axe to grind. She is not an unbiased individual whatsoever. She clearly hates the police. So how are you putting somebody like that in charge of making decisions and policy is beyond me.
Ken Zara also points out that it wasn't all that long ago, in 2017, that Chicago last updated the CPD's use of force policy. And while Lightfoot was not mayor at that time, she was heavily involved because she was head of the police board. Ken Zara says if it needs to be redone again now, well, that means that Lightfoot didn't do it right the first time. The mayor is looking to make other changes to police too.
That means taking the FOP head on and ensuring the police union contract represents our city's values, all of our city's values, and requiring licensing for police officers once and for all, just as we do with so many other professions.
As you heard earlier, the FOP is dead set against licensing.
Every officer in this state is certified through the state of Illinois training board. There are obviously provisions within that body that explain how officers can have that certification revoked. There's protocol. This is just another layer. It's an attempt to get rid of the collective bargaining rights and break the union. It's as simple as that. And shame on the Democrats, who are supposed to be pro-union, to even entertain this conversation.
Now, all of this goes to show the difficulty ahead for reform and for the mayor. On the opposite end of the FOP are critics like Alderwoman Jeanette Taylor, who says that the mayor isn't doing enough. Taylor has her own ideas for changes she wants to use of force policies.
Any police-involved shooting, you automatically get 60 days of desk duty. Automatically, you're taken off the street as an investigation. That put trust back in the community.
The CPD does have a dashboard website, really, that tracks use of force, and the data shows a 14% decrease in use of force since this time last year. As for that community task force, it is set to meet once a week for the next 8 weeks, virtually, of course. Brandis, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And now to Carol Marine with advocates for police alternatives. Carol.
Brandis, for many people, calling the police to handle everything from noise complaints to neighbor disputes is a reflexive response. But for some, a troubled history with police makes calling 911 a very hard choice. Moreover, police are not psychologists or social workers. They're officers of the law, with focus intensifying on where and how police resources are best used. Some communities are seeking ways to reduce their dependence on law enforcement as a solution to all of their problems. Joining us to talk about alternatives to calling the police are Chris Patterson, Senior Director of Programs and Policy at the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago; Alexa James, Executive Director of the National Alliance on Mental Health Chicago; and Neha Gill, Executive Director of Apnagar, an advocacy organization that works to end gender violence. Thanks all of you for joining us on Chicago Tonight. Alexa, let's say somebody's involved in a mental health crisis. If they don't call police at 911, who do they call and what happens?
Well, they call us. They call our helpline. They call a suicide lifeline. I mean, here's the thing. We need to redefine what the police should be doing, because they're pretty restricted when somebody's in a mental health crisis. They have one option. If clinicians can intervene and really intervene early before people are acutely ill, there's many more options and many more opportunities to intervene in a way that isn't traumatizing and doesn't put them in front of the police department.
Chris, if there's loitering in front of my house or a raucous party at 3 in the morning and I don't want the neighbors arrested, I just want them to stop, short of calling police, what do I do?
One of the things that we've been doing is helping people establish true relationships where lines of communication could be brought out. Another thing that we've been encouraging community residents, as well as having the support of law enforcement, is contacting the Institute for Nonviolence and organizations in your local community that could jump in when it doesn't seem appropriate to call police because of non-criminal offenses.
Neha, victims of domestic violence often fear that calling the police is going to create another problem. Their husband or their boyfriend is going to be arrested. They don't want that. They just want to stop being hurt. What do they do?
Carol, that's absolutely true for the survivors that we serve. They're looking for safety for themselves and their children and other members of their family. They're not necessarily looking for punishment or to have the abuser arrested. So we have a 24-hour crisis line, and a lot of the calls we get is about asking us actually to intervene, to have the violence stop, but not have law enforcement involved and have the situation progress and become worse. So just as has been mentioned before, it's all about kind of creating relationships with the survivors that we serve, with the community members that our agency is a part of in terms of the communities that we serve, and sort of establishing trust and a rapport so that people can call us and we can kind of walk them through what might be best options for them.
Two things. One, I don't know that people automatically know how to call each of you, correct?
Correct.
So where is the solution coming from in that regard? Alexa?
There has to be a tremendous amount of community education, but there is this knee-jerk reaction to call 911, and we see that in the volume. But we also know that communities who have poor relationships with the police, which could be the city or communities that feel over-criminalized, are much more hesitant to call for first responder service, even during a mental health crisis, although we still see those numbers higher in the Black and Brown community than in the white community. So that means something to me. And what that means is the police have become the safety net for mental health. And for the last decade, we have de-invested for mental health services and intervention, and we have really invested in training. And we have said to the police, the social service safety net has fallen. You are going to pick up this, and we are going to train you so you can do so. And many officers have met that with enthusiasm, and we have seen them do incredible work, but it's not their job, and it's incredibly expensive. And even when an officer is wonderfully de-escalating and trauma-informed and lovely in connecting them to care, you're still exposed to law enforcement on the most intimate moment of crisis of your life. We have to do better. We have to make sure that people know that there are resources in their communities that can reduce and divert the police involvement.
And Chris, speed sometimes is utterly of the essence. And so how do we persuade people that going to you, calling you as sort of their 911 is going to get them the relief that they need as quickly as they may need it?
The men and women who make up the professional outreach, street outreach field have spent lifetime building and developing relationships with those who are on the blocks and in the neighborhoods. And so what we want to do is just kind of put it out there and let them know that you can leverage those relationships so that we can intervene. Like, we're trained professional conflict mediators. And in almost every instance, people are welcoming our presence, right? So they don't have to play out acts of violence, that they don't have to call police, and a situation becomes escalated to the point of no return.
And Neha, ultimately, and especially I think you are familiar with this, domestic abuse sometimes means whether they want to call the police or not, the survivors of it, the police are ultimately going to be involved by necessity or by law, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the police could do something called a victimless prosecution as well. So I think what we try to do is make sure that we're available for the survivors even after, for example, if a call does need to be placed and the police are involved. We provide training for the police. We make ourselves available to them. A lot of the people that we serve come from culturally and linguistically specific communities. So we're able to kind of provide interpretation, support, and just sort of walk them through the process and actually be available for the police as well to make sure that, things don't go wrong.
Ultimately, to all of you, do we all need to be trained in de-escalation? Do we all need to engage in that process of de-escalation and not call someone else?
Carol, I just want to say, I do think that everybody needs a baseline training of de-escalation generally. We are a very, very agitated, angry, traumatized community that requires a lot of healing. So that's baseline. And we do need police and fire and OAMC to continue their mental health training because they are going to come into contact with people who are in crisis. They are part of the crisis system, absolutely. But what we need to do is think about, where are we spending our money first before people become acutely ill? Where can we spend money so that we, just like 911, somebody will always respond to them from the mental health system? And currently we don't have policies and funding to support that much mobile crisis work right now.
I will have to leave it there, but we thank you so much, all of you. Alexa James, Chris Patterson, and Neha Gill.
Thank you.
Up next, we check with Paris Schutz, reporting live in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. But first, a look at the weather.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, COVID-19 upended the American healthcare system, and it might affect what you pay for your health insurance. It's one of the toughest times in history, and these students managed to not only graduate high school, but to come out on top. Ways in which the Shriver Center on Poverty Law is helping protesters, and how a nonprofit is helping children use art as an expressive outlet. But first, we check back in with Paris Schutz, who's co-anchoring tonight from Bronzeville on the south side. Hey, Paris.
Hey, Brennis. Yeah, and now we're joined by Karen Freeman Wilson, CEO and president of the Chicago Urban League, based right here in Bronzeville. That group works for economic, educational, and social progress for African Americans in Chicago. Former Gary Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we've seen the disparity in how COVID-19 has impacted the African American community. Let's look at a graphic showing that where African Americans still are getting sick and dying at a disproportionately high rate. What are the biggest challenges in getting that number down?
Some of the challenges are the inability to work from home. Many African Americans work in jobs that require them to show up every day. In addition to that, you have environmental issues that lead to respiratory challenges that lead to underlying diseases. And so if you are in a place that's more polluted, you're going to have asthma, you're going to have bronchitis, which is an underlying disorder that may make your form of COVID-19 worse. In addition to that, you have the fact that they are at a higher incidence of unemployment. All of those factors lead to health outcomes. It's basically the social determinants of health.
And you spoke about people being out of work. You've got small businesses that are out of work right now, and then you add in some of the property damage that happened a couple weeks ago. How worried are you about some of these businesses in South and West Side business quarters coming back?
We're very concerned. We know that as a result of the civil unrest in the 60s, there were businesses and business corridors that did not come back on the West Side. And we're concerned because of how hard these businesses have worked and how hard organizations like the Urban League, like QCDC, have worked to build a vibrant business community here in Bronzeville and other places, that it will be very difficult for those businesses to come back. There's a trickle-down effect, if you will, or a layered effect, because those businesses employ people who live in this community.
And say here in Bronzeville, you know, it's been impacted and the community's been trying to sort of regain some of its glory from the past. How does it go about doing that in the face of these challenges?
Well, I think that you certainly have those business organizations that band together to work towards that end. But I also think that it's important that the city, that the state, that the federal government provide extra support for those businesses that were already reeling as a result of COVID-19.
You know, there was this recent WBEZ analysis on redlining and,
Sure.
and the practice that banks have just not lent to homeowners in Black and brown communities. How do you change that?
Well, I think it presents an opportunity for us to sit down with those banking institutions and think about their practices and how those practices may be really a result of institutional problems with policies that those banks have implemented. Is there an opportunity to revisit those policies? There has to be. And how do we undo what has happened in the past?
And what other resources is the Urban League providing for business owners or residents?
Well, we have a small business center, the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, where we are working alongside with those businesses. We're providing coaching, we're providing marketing, we're providing support to help them get back up and running. The same is true in housing, education, and workforce development.
All right, Karen Freeman Wilson of the Chicago Urban League and former mayor of Gary, Indiana, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Brandis will be back with more from Bronzeville in a bit, but now we go back to you.
Okay, Paris, thank you so much. Up next, will health insurance premiums rise because of COVID-19? Answers to that and more right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the City Club of Chicago.
Smart people may disagree about what makes a great city, but part of what makes Chicago great is that we don't have to agree. To run a city like ours, a lot of issues come up. The City Club of Chicago is a place to debate those issues and hear from the men and women who shape the policies, lead the industries, and tell the stories that define our city. For the free and open exchange of ideas, the City Club of Chicago.
The novel coronavirus has been an unprecedented upheaval in the U.S. healthcare system. A report earlier this year from California's health insurance marketplace warned the cost of coronavirus care could be as high as $250 billion, and that health insurance premiums could rise as much as 40%. As companies start setting their premiums for the coming year, what can consumers expect, and will the healthcare system see lasting changes prompted by the pandemic? Joining us with more are Catherine Baker, Dean of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, and Shelby Livingston, a reporter for Chicago-based Modern Healthcare who covers the health insurance industry. Welcome both of you to Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Catherine Baker, let's start with you, please. Obviously, caring for coronavirus patients has obviously meant a huge commitment of healthcare resources. What's the overall demand on the healthcare system like right now?
Well, paradoxically, at the same time that the healthcare system caring for coronavirus patients is overwhelmed, the segment of the healthcare system that takes care of all of our other healthcare needs is wildly underemployed. So you have financial strain on some aspects of hospitals, healthcare providers from lack of patients at the same time that you have shortages of ICU beds and ventilators. So it's really a complex landscape for providers and for insurers.
Shelby Livingston, what kind of financial position are health insurance companies in at the moment?
So far, most health insurers, especially the large publicly traded ones, your Aetnas, your United Healths, your Cignas, they are bringing in a lot of premiums, but they are not spending a lot on medical care. So they have an excess of premium income right now. That's because we've been putting off routine care. We've been delaying expensive procedures like knee replacements, like hip replacements. And so for the most part, health insurers are sitting on a lot of cash.
And Shelby, the report from California that we mentioned earlier on the potential spike in health insurance premiums, that's kind of alarming. Do we have any indication of what premiums are going to be like?
There's been a couple of rate requests for 2021 made public. In large part, they're very modest increases. So they're not large increases due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's important to say that a lot of insurers are couching their rate requests. They're saying this could change as we get more information about when elective procedures resume and when patients start coming back for doctor's appointments. They're not sure yet if there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand that will raise costs in the future.
So it's too early then to say that COVID-19 is the reason for massive increases just yet.
Right. There's not an indication yet there's going to be a massive rate increase due to COVID-19. But like you said, things could change if we get another wave of the pandemic, or if patients start swarming hospitals for needed care that they put off.
And Catherine Baker, lots of people that they got their insurance through their employer, but then they were laid off. What kind of impact might that have?
Well, that's the other really important avenue for changes in insurance premiums. There are changes in the kinds of care that people are getting, but there's also change in the insurance pool as people move from their own employer-sponsored health insurance plan to Medicaid, or to being uninsured, or onto a spouse's plan. The risk pool that insurers have may be changing substantially and in a way that's unpredictable until we know what the change in employment rates is likely to look like through the rest of the year.
And Catherine, people are, delaying doctor's visits and non-essential treatments. Will that make for a buildup in healthcare costs down the road?
It depends how much of that care is put off or just foregone. Some people may not go in cases that are discretionary because they're afraid of being exposed to the virus in the healthcare system, or because they're hesitant to go in and see a doctor face to face. And maybe those situations will just resolve. Some of them they may not need care for, and some of them you're putting off until a later date. And some of them may get worse because they didn't get care early and result in more expensive care needed. So the net effect of that is really unclear, although right now we know there's just a dramatic drop in all non-COVID related care.
And do you expect lasting changes to the healthcare system once we're through the pandemic, Catherine Baker?
Some of the changes we're seeing may be for the better and may be lasting, and some may be for the worse. For example, telemedicine. We've been talking about telemedicine for a long time, but the take-up among providers and among patients has been really small until now, when everyone is adopting the new technology. And I bet that some of that is going to stick around, and that'll be advantageous to people who are living in areas without adequate providers, or where going in to see the provider is actually a risky thing. But that also means that there's probably more limited monitoring of things like substance abuse disorder and mental health, and there may be under-treatment of care that'll be important down the road for patients.
And Shelby Livingston, when do we expect to learn more about the cost of premiums?
We should expect to see more rate filings in the coming months, and probably closer to open enrollment, which begins in November, we'll have a firmer picture. But it's important to note that as insurers file rate requests, depending on how the rest of the pandemic goes, they may get some flexibilities to go in and change their rate requests. So things are going to be a moving target right now.
As so many things are right now. And my thanks to Catherine Baker and Shelby Livingston. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
This Thursday would have been the last day of school for Chicago public school students. Instead, they've spent the last 3 months learning from home after weathering an epic school year, complete with an 11-day teacher strike, global pandemic, and a reckoning of racial inequity. High school seniors didn't get the pomp and circumstance they'd expected, but they get to be the class that graduated under a tumultuous time. Here's a look at how some of them are being celebrated. A few things are the same: caps and gowns, diplomas, and pictures with proud family and friends. To mark graduation for the class of 2020, Senn High School organized what was supposed to be a drive-through graduation ceremony. It turned into a party on the school's front lawn.
I was like, dang, I don't get to go to prom with my friends. But it's like, regardless, we still gonna have parties. We still go talk to each other over the summertime.
Senn's valedictorian, Guadalupe Perez, was among a few dozen students chosen to participate in Chicago's first ever all-city virtual graduation ceremony for both public and private school students. She and 6 other valedictorians gave a speech together.
We all had our struggles. We all cried and had to overcome challenges. The class of 2020 is resilient. We are proud.
We are proud.
We are proud. We are first-generation students. We are first-generation students, which really stuck with me because I am a first-generation student, so I thought that was very suitable that I got to say that part.
Though initially disappointed about missing out on the traditional senior year activities like prom and a graduation ceremony, Perez recognizes what's really important is the accomplishment itself.
Back in elementary school, I wasn't really that good of a student for the first few years. Like I got C's and D's, and like I wasn't very smart. I even had to take special classes. And then now going from there to being the valedictorian of the class and graduating high school is like really meaningful and impactful to me.
The city's ceremony included Chicago's own Alexander Hamilton, actor Miguel Cervantes,
And I'm not throwing away my shot to celebrate the graduating class of 2020 in Chicago.
and speeches from the mayor, the governor, the cardinal, and another Chicago original, Oprah Winfrey.
And my hope is that this time of reckoning, a time that will be forever marked by the coronavirus pandemic and the plague of racial inequity, will propel you to the path of real justice for all.
Another valedictorian, Marine Leadership Academy's Alicia Martinez, says she was inspired by Winfrey's speech.
It makes me think that I can get in a really good place, give even more to my parents, and just have maybe someday be able to be that person that people look up to.
It's no wonder emotions are running high for the class of 2020.
I have no words for the emotion that I felt, seeing my parents so proud of me. It's I just want to keep making them more and more proud and see where I can go with all of this.
They've overcome what has been a challenging year for most adults and still managed to graduate high school. Maybe they didn't get the ceremony they'd always dreamed of, but what they did get might have made up for it.
It really hit me that, wow, we really graduated. And my friends started texting me saying how much they've been crying because of my speech and then seeing me on TV. They were like, wow, we can't believe this is actually happening.
Alicia Martinez says she's heading off to Bradley University in the fall to study business administration. And Guadalupe Perez says she's enrolling at Dominican University. She plans to study nursing and hopefully become a neonatal nurse in the future. Congrats to the class of 2020. And now we check back in with Paris Schutz, who joins us from 35th and King Drive in Chicago's Bronzeville neighborhood. Paris.
Yeah, Brandis, and I'm joined now by State Senator Robert Peters, whose State Senate district runs all the way from Streeterville along the lakefront over Grand Park, down here through Bronzeville, all the way to the border of Indiana. Senator Peters, welcome to Chicago tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been out at a lot of the protests. What's your takeaway from what's been happening out there on the streets in the wake of the George Floyd killing?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think people are angry and upset about the systemic racism that exists in our society, the fact that we've seen, people economically crushed the healthcare disparities we've seen during COVID. You know, I try to say George Floyd, you know, the protests that came out of that didn't just happen out of nowhere. It's years and years of organizing and anger and people who've just had enough and they want to see some change. You know, after 30 to 40 years of disinvestment, especially on the south side of Chicago, they just want to see some change. And I think that's what's coming out of this and what we're seeing right now. And I think we have a moment, an opportunity in this crisis that we can really create some systemic change.
One of the pieces of change that some folks want to see, that the mayor wants to see, that you support, is state licensing of Chicago police. How exactly would that work?
Yeah, so the specific details, we'll have to get in the nitty-gritty of it, but essentially, if you license a cop or you certificate a cop and then they commit, you know, something bad, an atrocity or a violation, they get pulled. And if you see enough people experience this, it creates a sense of accountability that can hold the rest of the department or the rest of the police force to sort of stay at to not be abusive and not be brutal. I do think that it takes a combination of things. I think that needs to be paired. I think we need to make sure that we move away from policing. It's not necessarily, you know, in some capacity. So when it comes to mental health, when it comes to people who need public health, that needs more funding.
You're saying this is part of the sort of the defund the police movement, but you're saying divert those resources to mental health and
so it's
other
like,
services.
One thing is, yes, we need to license the police. But what we need to do is think about things in an actual, real safety and justice sort of mechanism or belief for society. And one thing I always think about is, if you look at the safest communities in Chicago, they all have something in common. They have a grocery store, you can get your health care, people are paid well, they have good schools, they have, you know, they have a real power. And if we're able to bring that to every community, we're able to bring real safety and justice to people.
Well, that's an interesting point you make, because your district has both, has incredibly affluent communities with all those things in droves, and then other communities that don't. So as a state senator serving over a district like that, how do you reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I see is, I have a district that shows all of Chicago, both its beauties and the ugly side of it. But I need to make sure that folks who are up in the northern end of the district are on the equal plane as folks who are on the southern end of the district. And so my job for representing that is to make sure that the district is whole. And so, you know, I think that there's always sort of attention given to the idea that, politically I should just align with the more financially successful part of the district. But that's not my job. My job is to improve people's lives, and the way to do that is to bring real safety and justice to everyone.
How do you see that split as it relates to COVID-19 cases, you know, Streeterville versus Bronzeville or South Shore?
Yeah, I mean, you could just look at the cases, the testing, the death. You look at who the essential worker is, right? If you look at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, it's in Streeterville, it's an institution. The people who work there, though, they live in the South Shores and the South Chicagos. And so for me, I see the differences, you know, all the time. And I think the real fight is, you know, to go back to this conversation about safety, it's to make sure that someone in the south side of Chicago has a great hospital and has the actual access to something that should be a right, that they have good pay, that they have, you know, good schools, and that when it comes to testing and services that they get it, and that they should be afforded the same thing as the great folks who live in Streeterville. The idea is that they're often put at competition with each other, but I think the real fight is people like me saying it's time to make everything whole and making those bold decisions.
All right, State Senator Robert Peters, thank you so much for joining us.
Definitely, thank you.
All right. And Brandis, we'll wrap it up from Bronzeville in just a bit, but first we go back to you.
Sounds like a complex district, Paris. Thank you. Up next, meet the new CEO of the Shriver Center.
This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by ComEd, powering lives.
We have a tremendous source of untapped, efficient energy right here in our school. Let her rip, Jenny.
I kind of love this idea.
The ComEd Energy Efficiency Program has real ideas for making schools energy efficient.
Pedal faster.
The Shriver Center on Poverty Law has long aimed to help advocate for policies to help people in poverty in Illinois. But amid a pandemic and unrest centered around police brutality, some may argue the center's work now is more critical than ever before in addressing the needs of individuals and policy reforms. Joining us now is Audra Wilson, the newly appointed president and CEO of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. Audra Wilson, welcome to Chicago Tonight and congratulations.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, what kind of support has Shriver Center been able to lend the people who are protesting in the streets?
So there's obviously a lot that we've been doing right now. We have been looking at systems of systemic racism for quite some time as we do our anti-poverty work. So one of the first things that I did before starting officially was to work on our external statement of solidarity. We've also begun conversations with our community and advocacy partners to evaluate our policy agendas. We've been mobilizing our Racial Justice Institute, which is an innovative national leadership program that trains advocates about how to understand and address issues of race and implicit bias while advocating racial equity. And that's, of course, a very critical component of our anti-poverty advocacy. But the most important thing that we try to do is we are listening, our ears are on the ground, and we're trying to provide as much support to our partners who are more on the front lines of the protests and reacting directly to those.
Draw some of the links for us, if you would, about how poverty and racism are related.
Well, unfortunately, they are inextricably intertwined. And the COVID crisis, quite frankly, underscores that link and the things that many communities experience daily. So as an organization, we immediately mobilized to understand how the pandemic would affect communities in poverty. So we sent recommendations to Governor Pritzker, Mayor Lightfoot, members of Congress and the Illinois legislature across issues from housing to healthcare access, justice-involved individuals, families and child welfare, and workers, including domestic workers. And a few weeks ago, during the emergency legislative session, we saw the governor and the Illinois General Assembly include key measures in the budget and emergency omnibus bill to protect low-income families and communities throughout the state in the fight against COVID-19. So we've been fortunate to be able to celebrate some victories. For example, Illinois is now the first state in the nation to provide Medicaid coverage to low-income seniors over the age of 65, regardless of immigration status. And this is a monumental and critical first step towards expanding healthcare coverage to all undocumented Illinoisans, which is the largest group of residents in Illinois without coverage.
And Audra, how would you say, how do advocates and policymakers, how do those folks need to be looking at reforms, not just police reform, of course, but other policy reforms?
So I think looking towards policy reforms, the impact and understanding the depth of the impact is so important. When I mentioned some of the work that we do with the Racial Justice Institute, it is helping advocates recognize that they need to filter all of their work through a race equity lens and understanding the disproportionate impact that so many communities of color are facing right now. And that is a critical component of the work that they're doing. And so as an organization that supports other advocates, both attorneys and community-based activists and organizers, that's the work that we do in supporting them.
COVID-19, it's obviously, as you mentioned, it's impacted the communities that Shriver works with. How has that affected Shriver's work and those communities?
So, quite frankly, the work that we do as we are trying to promote economic justice and racial equity, that never changed. So in many ways, this just exemplifies the importance of the work that we do. So it's not so much that it changes what we do, but it just sort of narrows our focus. So we've had some of these victories. For example, in our housing realm, we were able to secure an appropriation of nearly $400 million in emergency rent and mortgage relief for families experiencing financial hardship. But we still continue to do our fighting for families. So in the community justice space, for Black Lives to Matter, we know that Black families must also matter. So for close to 3 months, DCFS has kept over 11,000 parents, children, and siblings apart, many of whom are Black. And this is completely and totally unacceptable. We know that in this pandemic, parents should be able to hold on to their children close in these very trying times. And even in the economic justice space, and we're thinking about November, we need people to vote for a fair tax in Illinois because we need fairness and equity to ensure low-income working families and the middle class get a break. and that the wealthy pay their fair share. So these are the things that we always want to make sure are front and center, especially in these times, to say that these are communities that are disproportionately impacted. And COVID and the racial unrest and other sorts of things, these are just examples of just how deeply entrenched our racial inequity is in this country.
And you just mentioned, the impact of COVID-19 on the foster families and that system. And it's something that Shriver Center has been focusing on more recently. Why is this a particular issue for you, something that's important for you all to focus on right now?
Well, as I mentioned before, you can't have conversations about lives and Black lives mattering without addressing this issue. It is high time for DCFS to address the disparate impact of its policies on Black families and lift this ban on in-person supervised visits. And so, we are using our platform to be able to call this to people's attention. You may have heard some folks that are coming out there saying that, as we're looking to opening up restaurants and opening up our city and opening up our state, the most fundamental thing here about keeping families together or reuniting families, that should be front and center just as much as opening everything else up.
Okay, more to come. You've only been on the job a few weeks. Audra Wilson, new president and CEO of the Shriver Center. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The Community Arts Center is making sure kids have an outlet to express themselves as the stay-at-home order not only limits their activities, but their resources. Arts correspondent Angel Edo takes us on a visit to the nonprofit called Sky Art.
I'm putting one of each pastel in each Ziploc bag.
Twice a week, Sky Art assembles about 50 art kits consisting of supplies such as colored pencils, sketchbooks, and canvases. They're hand-delivered every Friday to kids attending the community center.
Here you go. You're welcome. All right, have a nice day.
Sky Arts is the only free accessible art program in the whole city of Chicago, which is startling because we're so isolated on the far southeast side. But that means that on any given day, if a child shows up at that door and they're of the right age, 7 and up to 24, and wants to participate in our programs, they just come in.
Some kits encourage creativity and others are created specifically for the center's art therapy sessions, which are also free.
Art is generally a therapeutic practice and it's a stress relief, but art therapy is a little different. Obviously, someone administering it is an art therapist and they've had years of practice in development and assessment skills. It also has to do with materials you use. So if someone has suffered trauma, you have more restricted materials like pencils and paper as opposed to loose materials like clay or watercolor.
Ward has found it to be a productive method to help kids get out how they're feeling in ways they wouldn't in regular conversation. So I decided to have my own art therapy session to get a better understanding of how it works.
Art can be a really great way of them to communicate what's going on. And so the first thing I might do with someone in an art therapy session is kind of get an idea of where they're living. So I would say, if you were a bird and you were looking down on your house and the roof was up, why don't you draw me what your house looks like and where you sleep? So go ahead.
This is my front door. So you walk in and you can go, wow, this makes no sense. So this would be my grandmother's room. So this would be her bed.
All of those things, in 5 minutes, I learned more about you than, I disclosed to my therapist in 6 months, right? And so it gives you an idea and a starting point to kind of talk about everything.
Yeah, because it was interesting, like when you asked me just like who's in the house with you, I was like, wow, it's kind of, I was like, no, that's not a personal question, but that's really a question where you have to think about, is this something that I want to share or do I feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah.
Ward and her team are currently working to provide therapy to 70 children over the course of 5 weeks. From that point, she'll decide if the children need counseling elsewhere or can begin group art sessions at the center. Ward says she's grateful to provide a resource that helps start important conversations. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
See you next class.
All right now.
And if you're interested in an art kit, Sky Art is now offering curbside pickup. And volunteers with the Art Center say that because they've received such a strong response to their art therapy sessions, they recently added 2 therapists to their team. And that's our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And of course, you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7.
The debate over removing police officers from schools, and a photographer recalls taking memorable photos of James Baldwin and civil rights leaders. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we will see you tomorrow.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of its partners named Illinois Leading Lawyers by the Law Bulletin Publishing Company of Chicago.